and I am the mental health team lead psychiatric nurse on St Helena Island, and we'll get to where St Helena is in a minute.
Cool. My name is Tobias Bromley, and I'm a police constable on the island of St Helena.
And yes, he is my son. So, St Helena Island is a small island in the South Atlantic Ocean with a population of just over 4,000 people. It's generally a peaceful place, but that does not mean that our police officers do not face any dangers.
So before we start our presentation, I would like to pay tribute to Police Constable Leonard John Coleman, who died in the execution of his duties on this day, the 2nd of December, 42 years ago, in 1982. My colleagues back home on St Helena will be holding a memorial for him today.
So we just wanted to acknowledge Leonard's service on St Helena. So this is, if I get it right, this is where we are, in the middle of the South Atlantic Ocean. One of the more remote communities in the world. It has a weekly flight from Johannesburg when the weather allows, and actually over this, it's a good thing we came in the week before because yesterday's flight didn't make it to Joburg. It got stuck on St Helena. And there's a monthly supply ship from Cape Town. Hopefully this will work. It did work before. Okay. Basically, we had a lovely little graphic of an aeroplane flying, but basically it flies from St Helena. Here we go. Yeah, it takes 5.5 hours, and the plane is slightly bigger than that one. Not a whole lot, but it is slightly bigger.
It is a British overseas territory, and we do receive funding from the UK. However, it is a self-governing territory, which means that while legislation is based on UK law, we do have our own legislation, or more commonly known as our own ordinances.
So this is a picture of St Helena Island, and just to give you just some context, really. Where are we? So our prison is here, our police station is here, and the hospital where I work is there. So we're all fairly close together. With a small, relatively stable population, we all tend to know each other, or at least know who belongs to who in terms of family. So the person that Tobias may arrest, or I see in a clinic, may be the same person who serves us in the shop the next day.
We have been adopting a public health approach to law enforcement for years without realising it. To be clear, we don't have a document or a policy that states this, but what we would like to do today is give an example of what it looks like at a personal level when law enforcement, health professionals and others work together when a vulnerable person is arrested.
So to do this, we're going to use an example of a young man being arrested for assault and brought into police custody. When a person is seen as vulnerable, and I know we talked about vulnerability in policing yesterday, is arrested, myself or one of my mental health colleagues will assess the person in custody to determine if they are fit to be detained and fit to be interviewed. We've obviously changed some of the details to ensure his anonymity, but this is effectively an accurate account of how such a person is supported during the arrest and subsequent legal processes as we work to improve their life and reduce the risk of them reoffending. Let's call him John. This is our police station. Before John turned 18, he'd been in trouble and had been arrested several times. This was generally for relatively minor offences for property damage and graffiti. When he'd been arrested previously, police were concerned and had made a referral to mental health, but John politely declined any help at this time. From brief interactions that I had with him during previous custody assessments, it was obvious that he was struggling emotionally, and while he acknowledged that he needed help, he was just not able to accept it. And sadly, like a lot of young men, he also used alcohol to cope. But then he was arrested again, this time for quite a serious assault. The custody sergeant, recognising his vulnerability, contacted mental health, and I saw him in our police custody suite. So just to give you an idea of our fairly small police custody suite, that's the main reception. That's one of the cells. and that's the clinic room that I use normally when I interview people and do. There's been, I would say there's been a lot of failed projects on St Helena, but actually the police custody suite is probably one of our main success stories. Yeah. So it's only a few years old, it's clean, it has 4 cells, interview rooms and a clinical room. Like I said, that's the clinical room that I would use. While it is a place of detention, it's also a safe environment, and as the custody nurse, I'll normally see people in the clinical room rather than in a cell. Let me just remind you where we are. Right. When I saw John in custody this time, as opposed to previous times, gone was the belligerent, aggressive young man. Before me was a frightened youth who was crying and confused. He'd sobered up and was sorry for what he had done. My role, as I said, was to assess if he was fit to be detained and interviewed at this time. I determined that he was fit, but he also needed some time to talk. So though the police were waiting to interview him, they allowed me time to just sit and listen to John tell his story. He was scared, but having the opportunity to talk allowed him to discuss why he had declined help previously and to realise that he was now ready to engage with the mental health team. I was able to reassure him that I understood that he was not ready before, but that was in the past and this was his chance to change direction. I told him that we would not hold it against him, that he did not want to engage previously. What was important was that he was now ready to work with us, and I believe this was the beginning of our therapeutic relationship. Of course, he was still arrested, he still needed to be interviewed, and it was very likely he was going to be charged, and he was going to be in custody for quite some time. However, I was able to reassure him that I would come back and see him after the interview, and that if at any time he felt overwhelmed, he just needed to ask the custody sergeant to call me. The police have deadlines to meet with a person in custody, but such is our close working relationship that the mental health will always have access to the detainee if the detainee needs support, no matter at what stage they are in the custody process. The police did make the decision to remand John overnight, and he would go to court the next morning. When he was informed that he'd be detained overnight, he again asked to see me, so I came down to spend some more time with him. He was going to spend the night in custody cell, but we talked in the clinical room. John was quite open about the struggles he faced, that he felt abandoned by his family and remorse for the assault. He asked about court and if I could come with him, and I reassured him that I'd be there for him. And again, the mental health team have a very good relationship with our magistrate and will often accompany our patients if they go to court. So the next morning, Tobias and another officer took him to court. Prosecution and defence presented their arguments. Then the magistrate, seeing me sitting in the public area, asked if I thought that a mental health assessment was needed before he was sentenced. I explained to the magistrate that despite earlier difficulties engaging with John, I sensed a shift in his attitude, and I thought it would be worth reassessing him. The magistrate then decided to adjourn the proceedings for 2 weeks so that probation and mental health could produce a report. I saw John several times during this period, both by myself and with the probation officer. Our report acknowledged that John had experienced quite a number of adverse childhood experiences, that this impacted negatively on his ability to develop positive relationships and probably contributed to his problems with alcohol. So with probation, we proposed a plan that would be implemented jointly between probation and mental health. This would involve him engaging with mental health in therapy to work through his issues. He would also see the probation officer to develop skills in consequential thinking and practical measures to avoid situations that are high risk for him reoffending.
So, as we have said, St Helena is a small place, and I often know the people that I arrest, and in this case, John was no different. There was only one high school on the island. John was, I'd say, a couple years, 2 years below me. I knew him relatively well. Obviously, arresting people is part of my job. It's not a part I particularly enjoy. However, often when I arrest people who have mental health challenges, I am doing so in the knowledge that the person is not just being processed through the judicial system, but will also receive the help they need. In fact, we often work with judicial service and the mental health team to avoid criminalisation wherever possible. Our motto, the Royal St Helena Police Service motto, is to keep St Helena and its sister island Ascension safe. And I think it is important that we do this by taking a holistic approach to offenders and work to address their problems to reduce the risk of them reoffending. In a more punitive society, John may have not had the opportunity to receive help or safety for the community would have taken the form of incarcerating him. I was also involved in interviewing John with a detective. He was emotional throughout and broke down when he saw the evidence of the injuries that he had caused to the victim. It would have been easy to dismiss this as a ploy to gain sympathy, but knowing his history, I understood that at this point he was genuinely remorseful. The detective and myself came out of the interview with the intention of finding a way to support John while acknowledging that he had committed a serious offence. I finished my shift around midnight and was back in the next morning to take John to court. Ian had seen him earlier, and was going to meet us there. John was nervous and subdued. He was frightened of being sent to court. I sat with him and gave him reassurance and the opportunity to express his feelings so he would be calm by the time we got to court. As described earlier, the magistrate requested reports and John was free to leave the court on bail. I spoke to John and we went through bail conditions. There was no animosity in our conversation, and I was genuinely pleased with the result that was presented. I joined the Sentencing Police Force 4 years ago as a cadet, and I'm now his constable. In preparing for the presentation, I have been reading about law enforcement and public health. Where I came across the concept of procedural justice. As Rowling describes the 4 principles of procedural justice as dignity and respect, trustworthy motives, neutrality, and voice. It's about adopting a non-judgmental attitude, treating people with respect, and explaining those reasons for police action. Listening, and also by listening to what they have to say. An Australian survey by Murphy in 2015 concluded that procedural justice is even more important to young people than it is to adults. I feel privileged that I've started my career in policing and that I work for a service where such values are embedded in our work. Procedural justice is a natural part of my work, and in fact, it's the only way I know how to police.
So, both Tobias and I have reflected on the fact that when we read the literature on public health and law enforcement, we realise that in many ways we're already operating according to these values. And there's a chapter again in Law Enforcement and Public Health titled Law Enforcement and Mental Health, the Missing Middle. In this chapter, Stuart Thomas and colleagues explore the concept of mental distress as applying to those who fall somewhere between people receiving specialist mental health care and those who receive support from primary care services. Thomas describes how the threshold can be so high for admission to mental health services as to exclude the majority of people. But we are very fortunate on St Helena that there is no real threshold for admission to mental health services. When police are involved, it only takes a phone call. On St Helena, it is often the custody suite that is the setting for the involvement of the mental health team with persons in mental distress who've come to the attention of police. John did not have a severe and enduring mental illness. He was not receiving support from any other health or social services, but he was clearly in distress when arrested. He did not need to go to hospital, but in the midst of his distress, he had caused an offence and had broken the law. And this had to be addressed, as did his vulnerability. The chaos that he was experiencing had to be contained so that he could then focus on the underlying issues that were fueling this chaos. It needed to be done in a way that allowed him to recognise that he needed to accept support, and it was the close working relationship between the police and mental health team that calmed this chaos. They then initiated the process that led to court being able to divert him away from custodial sentence and into a treatment program to work through his mental distress. Now, it might seem counterintuitive that it's only after some people are arrested that they're in a position to accept help. It speaks to the way the St Helena police treat detainees in custody that when I am called, I often find a person who is calm and willing to talk to me. It's because they're treated with dignity and respect that they rarely continue to resist in custody, even if the actual arrest has involved them having to be physically restrained. So to get back to John, when he returned to court after the 2-week bail period, the magistrate made his remarks before sentencing. The magistrate reminded John that this was not the first time he'd seen John in his court. He remarked on the escalating seriousness of John's offences. He told John that these offences were severe enough that he could go to prison. However, having read the report and accepting the recommendations from probation and mental health, he agreed to give John one last chance. He would not send John to prison, but he would need to work with probation and mental health to address his offending behaviour. And it's early days, but I am pleased to say that John is working with us, and he is acknowledging that past traumas and adverse childhood events have contributed to his offending. So where do we go from here? Michael Peters, in his reflection on working with an individual who was incarcerated at a young age, but who went on to turn his life around, states,
If all of the support systems for individual need can support the development of one item at a time, it acts as a building block. Over time, these blocks create a strong foundation that enables and empowers the individual to begin living a more positive life that they can take ownership of.
So, in conclusion, I believe that the collaboration between police, probation, court and the mental health team has built a strong foundation and that we are actually helping to change lives. But what we've not done is to formally recognise that we take this collaborative approach between the mental health team and the police. And as I said earlier, there is no policy or strategic document that acknowledges this approach. How we achieve this will involve a discussion between police and the health and social care portfolio and St Helena. But, I hope that our presentation today will be the catalyst for the discussion and a formal commitment to embed this approach in our work with offenders. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Sounds like an opportunity for me to write up a case study.